Well, that was a pretty epic intro, wasn't it? But it had better be, because this is going to be an epic series. Now, something you might not know about me is that I am a geographer, and as a result, I love a map. And my favourite kind of map is your trusty Communal Garden Ordnance Survey map. And during lockdown, we've been dragging our unwilling children on weekly hikes every Saturday, taking great pleasure in unfolding the enormous unwieldy map of the local area, spreading it out on the kitchen table, and planning where we will go. And some of our walks have taken us along the River Thames. And every time we walk along the river, it seems as though new flats, buildings and tower blocks have sprung up out of the earth. The scenery is ever changing. The London skyline is always being added to and developed, but running through the heart of it, unchanging over centuries, is the River Thames. The City of London was founded by the Romans, who liked this spot on the Thames because they could quickly transport goods to and from the continent. Over time it was invaded by Vikings and Normans, then it became the centre of politics under the Tudors. Governments rose and fell, plagues, came and went. It got burned down, rebuilt, bombed in 2 world wars. But in all this time of change, the Thames was constant, supporting life and trade to London's inhabitants. It continued to snake its unhurried way through the heart of the city as the city changed around it. Well, for us, like for London, change is constant, especially at present. The changing rules, the changing advice, the changing conditions, things are changing constantly. We are changing constantly. And the best way to cope with change is to get to know God, who doesn't change. Change is constant, but God is constantly unchanging. Now, this immutability, that's my new word. This unchangeableness, that's my made-up word. This constancy of God is who he is. It's part of his character. God has not and will not change. He does not change. And this is great news for us, because it means that his love for us will never change. So let's look at these points in turn. He has not changed and will not change. As Tim mentioned earlier, in Hebrews it states that God is the same yesterday, today and forever. And when you look at that with Revelation 1 verse 8, it makes for some powerful reading. In Revelation, God tells us that he is Alpha and Omega, beginning and end, first and last, from eternity past to eternity future. He has always been and will always be. The same for every generation, generations past, generations to come, our generation. We are loved by the same God who was there at the beginning of time, who spoke life into the world, who spoke to Abraham, who spoke to the disciples on the Sea of Galilee, who spoke to your ancestors and speaks to us today. We worship that same God who has been there throughout history. As the world has been constantly changing, God has been constantly unchanging. He does not change, thank goodness. Perhaps you find the idea a bit unnerving, this unchangingness. Maybe you prefer the idea of a God who does change, who maybe mellows a bit, or overlooks the occasional misdemeanour, or maybe adapts himself as culture changes. As London has grown and changed, the Thames has not, and so it is with God. Rather than changing to adapt to our culture, God has stayed constant, unwavering. He is outside and above our earthly trends and changing traditions. Or perhaps you doubt his constancy. Maybe sometimes you feel like he might have forgotten you, or wonder whether he's changed his mind about you because, well, maybe you have forgotten him for a little while. In Malachi 3 verse 6 it says, I, the Lord, do not change. And it's this permanence of his character that assures us that we can trust him. We need him to be unchanging. Now stay with me here because this is a weird one to explain. Because God is perfect in his purposes, his plans, his promises, any change in him would inevitably have to be for the worse. Because God is perfect, in order for God to change, he would have to be less of something, less powerful or less loving or, hideous thought, less forgiving. Well, that sounds pretty hideous to me. So when we hear that God himself tells us that I, the Lord, do not change, that is great reason for celebration. While change in our lives is constant, God is constantly unchanging. His love for you does not change. In Isaiah 54 verse 10, God says, "Though the mountains be shaken and the hills be removed, yet my unfailing love for you will not be shaken, nor my covenant of peace be removed." No matter what changes in this world today, mountains shaking, hills disappearing, global pandemics, schools open, schools closed, masks on, masks off, the love of God for the people he created never changes. It's because God's character does not change that his love for you is also constant. In Romans, we're reminded that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing you can do and nothing that can be done to you can make him love you any less. He can't love you anymore. He won't love you any less. His unchanging love for his children is part of the character of God. And while our affection for him may be constantly changing, God is constantly unchanging. So in this time of change, where are you planting your feet? Are you feeling tossed and turned by the fear of the unknown? Do thoughts of the future cause you anxiety? Is this storm of global events shaking your foundations? We are all invited to anchor ourselves on the rock, the immovable, immutable, unchangeable God. He will give you a firm place to stand, a steady, consistent, permanent place to pitch your tent, where you need have no fear of the unpredictable fluctuations of life. His love for you is unshakable. He has always been there. He will always be there. And while change is constant, God is constantly unchanging. And next time you go on your daily exercise, why not pop down to the Thames, the constant watery presence through the history of this city, and may it remind you of the constancy of God.